let me introduce myself. I'm Catriella Friedman, and this is officially the first class of my new Jewish learning initiative called Tanu. So thank you everybody for joining. We're recording live from Zichron Yaakov, from the beautiful Neveh Baron Synagogue Library. And this will be uploaded to YouTube, and we'll see if we can get the audio up to Spotify as well. So for everyone who's joining the class, you will have different ways of accessing the recordings. So I know, like Kayla, you mentioned you have to leave early. You'll always be able to get the rest of it online. And if you have any issues for this course, you can always tell me. So I just want to explain a little bit about who I am and why I started this Jewish Learning Initiative. So I grew up in LA, and my background is in Jewish studies. And I was always drawn to it since high school. I went to a Jewish day school, but even in my undergraduate years at Princeton, I decided to do my senior thesis on Maharal. So I got really into Jewish studies. And then at Harvard, I was in the PhD program there, but I spent time at Drisha, a year at Drisha, and also a year at Midrash at Lindenbaum when it was still called Bravenders. I'm not going to give the year because it's so long ago, but I would say that I have two inspirations for what I do, many inspirations, but two main inspirations. First is my mom, Alea Shalom, who was really ahead of her time in terms of being an intellectual in the late 40s, early 50s. She was born in Vienna and escaped from the Holocaust, and was her parents ended up surviving as well, and they were all in New York. And she ended up, against her parents' wishes, going to Brooklyn College, getting her BA, and started a PhD program at NYU. And her parents were mortally against. I mean, they were so embarrassed by this and against it. A woman in the late 40s, early 50s, getting an education. They said, "Why don't you work? Why don't you get married?" She did end up getting married to my dad, who was Israeli and formerly Hasidish. And they built a home first in New York and then in LA. But the thing about my mom is that she was a real intellectual. She had a huge library. My dad, not so much. My dad was like a streetwise kind of person. But my mom was really, surrounded herself with books. And when I started to become more religious, and then later my dad became a Baal Tshuva, but when I started to become more religious, she always probed for, like, how can you teach me? How can we learn together? Where's learning for me? And she was very rusty in Hebrew. She spoke Yiddish, but very rusty in Hebrew and in Hebrew reading. But she always felt like, she would always say to me, there's nothing for someone like me. Like, there's nothing accessible for someone who's intelligent, but doesn't want to start Hebrew school. And so that was a real inspiration for me. And then when I realized it's actually a talent of mine, I don't give chidushim. I'm not like very innovative, but I'm really good at taking material and making it accessible. At PJ Library, that's kind of what I did also. Like, I'm a good curator. But if you ever feel like something is not advanced enough, or you don't look, I have this background, so they don't even see you. If someone ever feels that it's not advanced enough, or it's too advanced, you can always let me know, and I can, try to make it's always a challenge, but an exciting challenge, because we have people in this room who have been learning Gemara for years and years, and we have people in this room who have never learned before. So, it's always a challenge to hit it right. And sometimes the group kind of decides, but if you ever feel like it's not where you're at, always let me know. So the other thing I wanted to say in terms of inspiration is when I was at Bravenders, of course, the girls who were learning at Bravenders, we had classes with Rabbi Bravender. And at the time, he was very revolutionary in terms of really, teaching women on a very high level in Talmud and in Torah and everything. And one of my friends asked him, "Why, Rabbi Bravender, you've caused so much controversy for yourself by doing this. Why do you do it?" And he sat back and he said, "All my life, I teach what I know." And I felt like that just distilled everything to its basic thing. It doesn't matter who you're teaching, what you're teaching. It's sort of like an obligation. You teach what you know. If you know something, you should teach it. And that's always driven me, because I'm very bad at research. That's why I didn't finish my PhD. I hated being in the library. But as soon as my graduate fellowship was taken away and I had to teach, I all of a sudden blossomed. Because if I have to teach it, then I'll know it. And then when he said it in the opposite way, it's almost an obligation. If you know something, teach it. And so that's why we're here. Okay, so I see someone else is trying to get into the waiting room. 1 second.
It's my sister.
Yeah. Should I let her in?
Yes.
Okay. You sure? She joined as a guest. Okay. Ruth joined. Hold on.
I'm supposed to pay you money.
Don't worry. We'll deal with everything in a timely fashion. So today I felt like, so let me just tell you a little bit about this course for people who are new. This is a group. Some of these people have been learning together for 3 years. And the group, the class changed names. It's now called Meet the Sages. And basically our inspiration was we took Pirkei Avot. We've been taking Pirkei Avot and using it not as a way of understanding morality and how to live a good life, because that I'm not really good at teaching that, but using it as a prism by which we can understand more about the sages, more about the rabbis who created the Mishnah and the Gemara and a lot of what we live today, basically created Rabbinic Judaism, which we're all inheritors of. And so we use Pirkei Avot as a jumping off point for us to go deeper. At this point in this part of the course, we're already towards the end of Pirkei Avot, because Pirkei Avot stops being chronological at a certain point, but we're continuing to learn about the sages who basically edited the Mishnah and then became the main commentators for the Gemara. In historical terms, we're after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash, the second temple that was in Jerusalem. So it's a very dramatic period. And we're at the period that we call the Yavne period, when the scholars in the Sanhedrin, the main court, halachic legal court that had been in Jerusalem at the temple, now have migrated to Yavne. So these are Jews who are living post-destruction of the temple. They are trying to create a new environment in Yavne. They're building a Beit Midrash. There are more than one Beit Midrash. There's more than one learning center, but the center really is Yavne. And they're trying to centralize power in many respects. The sects that had been alive and well and flourishing during the Second Temple have really died down for the most part. So those sects are like the Sadducees, which were really the Kohanim, really the priests. They were the landed aristocratic class, and they were allied with the Romans, but also not allied with the Romans, and very kind of focusing their power in the temple. Of course, without a temple, their power recedes. They were the more powerful, in many respects, more powerful at different points. We also, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Essenes, the Dead Sea, the Dead Sea Scroll sects. And we're not going to go so into them because, again, since the destruction of the temple, where their focus was so much on purity and temple practice, without the temple, their power recedes as well. There's another major sect that continues to flourish and eventually becomes a problem for us in particular, and those are the Christians. Who really, after the destruction of the Second Temple, become very, very powerful, but it'll take a while. In fact, there are scholars who say that around the destruction of the Second Temple, 10% of the Roman Empire, the Romans, of course, destroyed the temple. They're the ones in charge of the most of the civilized world at this point. And there are some scholars who claim that at the point of the destruction of the temple, 10% of the Roman Empire was Jewish. Meaning that Romans themselves, were looking for something. You know, when you have a major shift in power, and there wasn't really a shift in power, but destruction and sort of the end of days kind of feeling, people turn to religion. And a lot of regular Romans turned to Judaism as an answer for some of their most burning messianic questions. And so Christianity came at a point where people were searching, and we'll get into Christianity more. In fact, Sarah, you should come to next week's class in person because we will be talking more about heretics next week. But given that today is the day before Purim, it felt like of 2025, it felt like this was a really opportune time to look at how the rabbis post-destruction looked at the Megillah and looked at the character of Esther. So let's do that today. Cool. So I'm going to share my screen, which of course I was very careful to get ready before I went. But okay, now for anybody who's looking on Zoom and it's not big enough, you should know that you can extend it on your own. So just so you know, I looked it up. I made it as big as I can, but if you're having problems seeing it, you can manually extend it. So the first thing I want to get into is, let's just for a moment, because we could spend a long time talking about how strange the book of Esther is, Megillat Esther, okay? How strange it is. And so I really recommend that if you're interested in exploring sort of what the genre of the book is and how it's different and how people read it through the ages, Rabbi Aaron Koller, Koller, is a professor at YU, and he's also associated with Yeshiva Chovevei Torah, but also like very well, publicized. And he has a book on the Book of Esther, but I just went to YouTube and watched a few videos of his, and he's amazing. So one of the questions that he raises, and I think it's worth just touching on now, is, think about when the book is situated, okay? And he phrases it in a way that, because I'm from PJ Library, Judy, it really spoke to me. He said, let's say you're writing a book in 400 BCE, right? Okay, you're writing a book and you wanted to get into the Bible. And for people who have been in my class for a while, you know that I referenced Louis C.K., who always talks about, he's not a good person to reference in general, but he always says, like, did people in the Bible say to themselves, hey, let's get into the Bible? Like, hey, we're going to be in the Bible. So I love the way Rabbi Koller references this, because he says, how do you get a book into the Bible? Like, how do you say, I want my book to be published in Tanakh? Okay. And what would be the ingredients? Like, if I told you right now, I want you to write a book that's going to get into the Tanakh, what would be, and Rabbi Koller limits it to 6 ingredients. What would be the 6 ingredients you need? First of all, where should it take place? If you want to get a book into the Tanakh, where should it take place?
Ideally in the land of Israel.
In the land of Israel, yeah. Exactly. In the land of, we have some exceptions like Yechezkel, and Daniel, but like mainly in the land of Israel, right? If you want to get a book into the Tanakh, 99% of it is taking place in Eretz Israel. Where does Book of Esther take place? Shushan, right? Yeah, not in Eretz Israel. If you want to get into who should be like a main character,
not a woman, not a woman,
right? Who should be the main character? Let's capital M, capital T, capital C. God, right? Who's missing that we talk about all the time? Who's missing from the Megillat Esther? God, right? How should the people behave? How should the Jews specifically behave in this book that you want to get published? Righteous, right? Like, they should be keeping kosher, they should be keeping Shabbos, like, do anything to keep mitzvot, right?
Or to come back to Israel.
Or right, we're going to get to that. They should have some sense of piety. We don't have any of that in Megillat Esther. I mean, we don't know what's going on there exactly, but it raises a lot of questions about what it means to live in the diaspora, right? Like, just there isn't a lot of that going on. Like, we have a lot of mefarshim, we have a lot of commentators later that say Esther brought her own food, it was double wrapped from Meal Mart, but we don't have any of that in the text, none of that in the text. So, it's a lot of, if you're looking at any book in the Torah, in the Tanakh, that takes place after Yehoshua, let's say, who should be kind of leading things? What dynasty should be? David, right? But what did we have in Megillat Esther? Who does Mordechai? Binyamin. And who, by the way, which king came from Binyamin? Shaul, right? So every book in Tanakh post when we start with Shmuel, right? We just read it last week, the Haftorah, where Shmuel basically derides Shaul and says, your line will never rule again. Okay. Who do we have saving the Jewish people but the descendants of Shaul, Mordechai and Esther? Okay. And what's really interesting, if you want to delve deeper with Rabbi Koller and look up any of his videos, he does a whole analysis, which is fascinating, a linguistic analysis of how Mordechai and Esther speak in the language of Shaul. It's not trying to say that this is a tikkun. The Mefarshim, the commentators will say this is meant to fix what Shaul did. But he shows, no, it's Shaul is alive and well in many respects, and it highlights the good parts of Shaul's kingship. Okay, so we've got, I'm trying to see, what did we go through? We have the land of Israel, God, piety. Okay, we have the Davidic dynasty, but we also have, and people who are online can see this, we also have what is central to every conversation that takes place after post-Torah, but also in the Torah, the Mishkan, and then the Beit HaMikdash. And ironically, you mentioned this, the Beit HaMikdash is in the process of being completed during the time of Mordechai and Esther, but we don't have any reference to it, and they're not there. Mordechai and Esther are not there. They're not part of the development. They don't talk about it. They're not part of it. The Beit HaMikdash's existence or non-existence is not a part of it, except for the Keli, Shoni, right? Which we'll talk about in a moment. So we don't have any reference to it. And then the last thing that Rabbi Koller mentions is Jewish law or ritual. We don't really have a reference or development, and we'll talk about that more, of something having to do with, this is how we're dealing with Jewish law, this is how we're dealing with ritual. So it's a really fascinating kind of perspective on how Megillat Esther is so different. Now, of course, many of you know that there's one aspect of all those things that really didn't sit well with commentators from the moment it became a really popular book. And it affects the people of our time period, the people post Second Beit HaMikdash, because these are people who are dealing with the final aspects of canonization. They're dealing with the final aspects of saying, Zeu, this is our Tanakh, and this is not, and this is in, and this is out. So we have a lot of conversations about Shir Shirim, Song of Songs, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and Megillat Esther. In fact, the tractate that focuses on Megillat Esther, the tractate in the Talmud that focuses on Megillat Esther, is called Masechet Megillah. We're going to have a lot of references to it today. Tractate Megillah, one of the number one questions addressed in that tractate is canonization, is which books belong in and which books belong out. And one of the questions is Esther. So what is the main reason why the sages felt like Esther should not be in the Tanakh? The argument, or what one of the reasons they're trying to defend it, God is missing, right? You don't have another book in Tanakh where God is completely absent. And so this speaks to people in very different ways. This speaks to people in very different ways, and we're going to look at some of it now. Let's focus now though on our rabbis, our guys, our sages, and how they looked at it. So if we look at the first text, this is a quote from Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. And in this class, we always try to look at Talmudic passages in context. So the context is, this is coming from Masechet Megillah, which I just mentioned, Tractate Megillah, but the context of it is a discussion of a Mishnah talking about this, the fact that once the temple is gone, sacrifices cease. Okay, which was not so with the Mishkan, which was not so with the tabernacle. When the tabernacle was gone, sacrifices continued. But with the temple, once it's gone, sacrifices cease. in the context of that conversation, Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina says, he quotes Megillat Esther, and he says, Baharato et osher kavod machuto. Achashverosh has a party, right, at the beginning of Megillat Esther, a huge party. And it says, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor, doesn't have this pasuk here, but the honor of his majestic tiferet, greatness. So Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, this is the first source, says, Milamed shelavash bigdei kahuna, that actually Achashverosh came out in the bigdei kahuna, in the clothing and the vestments of the high priest, which is, as you know, a major no-no. First of all, why isn't it at the temple? And second of all, why is it in Shushan? And third of all, why is a non-Jewish priest or king wearing it? Okay, so it raises a lot of questions. And Ketiv, what is Yossi Bar Chanina's support for this? Ketiv hacha yakar tifer gdulato, because it says in Megillat Esther, it describes it as tiferet, as glorious, as majestic. Uchtiv hatam, and it says in Shmot, when it's talking about bigdei kahuna, the clothing of the kohen, it says lechavod uletifaret. Okay, so it's that word tiferet, that connects the two psukim. But why is Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina saying this? Like, where is this coming from? It's a kind of outlandish thing to say. But if you think about it, it's not so outlandish. Because a few psukim later, and I just sang it to you in my bad voice, when it's still talking about the party, it says in Pasuk Zayin, 7th Pasuk in the first chapter of Megillat Esther, V'hashkot b'chlei zahav v'kelim mikelim shonim, v'yayin malchut rav kiyad hamelech. And so it says, royal wine was served in abundance as befits a king, in golden beakers of varied design, of diverse design. We know from, if any of you are used to hearing the Megillah is read in a trope. It's read in ta'amim that are very much major, right? It's a major sounding, like it's happy, it's joyous. And all of a sudden, those two words, kelim shonim, are read in the exactly of the sound of the notes of Eicha, which is the saddest. It's in contrast to Megillat Esther. Megillat Eicha is sad and mournful. So why do we read those two words like that? Why kelim shonim? Why are very diverse kelim read in that sad way?
They came from the Beit Hamikdash.
Why do you think they came from the Beit Hamikdash? What makes you think that? Because
the Babylonian exile.
Right. Well, okay, but the Beit Hamikdash is practically built. Like we know the second Beit Hamikdash.
Maybe they took them first.
Okay, so this is all based on commentary. So the fact that we read it differently is based on the same commentary that comes from our first source, which is commentary that develops in this time, in the time of Yavne, and a little bit before as well, that is looking at Achashverosh through the prism of what they've just experienced, right? Who is the Rasha? Sorry, did it say Rasha here? No, it's going to say Rasha in a second. Who is the evil person for these rabbis? They don't really talk about Haman so much. They talk about Achashverosh. And why would Achashverosh be such a pivotal, evil, wicked man for these rabbis, for the rabbis of Yavne?
Because he still has, I mean,
from their point of view.
because he took the big day kuna and he took the kelim
And why did
and everything that comes with that.
But they specifically are identifying with the evil empire. They're identifying with a situation of losing their temple and being subsumed under this evil empire, because the Romans are just as and even more powerful than the Persians were, right? And the Persians had some good emperors. So did the Romans, right? It's Cyrus, it's Koresh who lets the Jews go back and start rebuilding. But we won't get into that because we're focusing on our sages here. the sages post Second Temple are reeling from a massive destruction, massive massive forced movement into slavery, massive taxation. And when they read about Achashverosh, they're relating to it. And they're saying, this is the guy who was not just putting, even before Haman comes into the picture, they're seeing him as a Rasha. They're seeing Achashverosh as a wicked, wicked emperor. And what do they read into that? He's taking on for himself the vestments, the clothing of the Kohen. He's taking the kelim. He's taking the utensils, the holy objects from the temple. Basically, he's grabbing all this for himself. Some of it may be related historically to how they read historically from Nebuchadnezzar, who had conquered, who had destroyed the first temple, and some of it from Ezra, because there was a king named Achashverosh who's mentioned in Ezra, who's not the same one, but who's mentioned in Ezra as putting a stop to the building of the second Beit HaMikdash. So they could be reading that into it as well. But I also think there's more to it. I think they're identifying with this situation. And remember, there's a common perspective. Remember who these rabbis are. They're living post-destruction, but before Bar Kokhba. So the destruction takes place in 70. And when is Bar Kokhba? 135. Almost 70 years after the destruction of the temple. So what are they still holding out hopes for? Rebuilding, redemption. 70 years. The second temple is built 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar. So they're really identifying with Achashverosh, with his wickedness, with his attempt I'm losing my words, but to his attempt to pillage everything that's treasured and the centerpieces of the temple.
And of course, it's really
and speak loudly so we can hear.
It's a literary device.
Yes.
So the people are offended by what I'm saying, but it's a literary device so that people can connect. People who are reading the Megillah will be able to connect to, the kelim. It'll all be familiar to them.
Yes, that's right.
And everything. So it's kind of
exactly. It's exactly that. The word kelim, the word utensil, the word vessel is resonates with Jews, and especially when you're writing this. It's very, very good point. Okay, so let's look at a commentary.
These Jews could have come back, no?
Which ones?
Jews living in this time period could have
Yavne or Shushan?
Shushan.
Yes, they could have. Absolutely.
So they lived in a situation where you're explaining this, that they had fear they didn't feel safe. They felt like
I'm talking about the Jews living in Yavne, though, who are reading Megillat Esther.
Okay.
So, but we'll get back to the Jews of Shushan. So we're looking at things in parallel. We're looking at what we're looking at today is how the Jews of Yavne, how the rabbis of Yavne relate to the Jews of Shushan who are living 500 years before them.
Okay.
And they're seeing parallels in that experience. So now let's look at Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, just to relate to him a moment, he is one of the prominent students of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, as you know, is Rabbi Akiva is the major supporter of Bar Kokhba, and he is obviously in the mode of redemption. And he is one of the advocates for Megillat Esther being included in the canon of Tanakh. That is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is famous because he, like Rabbi Akiva, was being chased by the Romans for teaching Torah. Okay, Rabbi Akiva is caught and then later murdered by the Romans and martyred by the Romans. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is not. Why is he not caught? Because he hides in a cave, and there are all sorts of stories about him, and he becomes a figure of great focus, of intense focus by the Kabbalists and mystics. But we're not going to get into that now. I just wanted, he has a very fiery personality, And here he is in a class teaching his students. And when these days were fulfilled, the king made a feast for all the people that were present in Shushan, the capital. Again, the introduction to Megillat Esther. Shalu Talmidav et Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai ask him, Mipnei nitchayavu soneim shel Yisrael sheboto hador kalaya. Why were, and this often happens in rabbinic literature, instead of saying something outright, it says it in code. So it says, why were the enemies of Israel? But what it really means is, why were the Jews? Like, why were the Jews so bad? What was so bad about the Jews during the time of Shushan, right? So again, these are people who are living at the cusp of Yavne and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, talking about Shushan, okay? So why were those Jews so bad that they were about to be destroyed, okay? And so Amar Lahem, as a very good teacher, he says, Amru Imru Atem, you tell me. So he says, yeah, you tell me. That's a really good strategy. Amrulo, so they said to him, Mivnei shenenu misudato sha'oto rasha, because they enjoyed the feast of that very same wicked person. And we know politics, and this is so apropos what we were going through every single day, always, but it just seems heightened over the last year and a half. Politics and the sacrifices or the excuses people make in the name of politics will really like know no limits. And so what are the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai saying? What are they saying? They're saying, hey, at that Shushan, and all those feasts, the text does not tell us who goes to those feasts and who doesn't go to those feasts. We have to assume from the pshat, we have to assume from the simple reading of the text that everyone went, because if everyone didn't go, they would have ended up like Vashti, right? They would have ended up skewered. So obviously, who was there? The Jews, not just the Jews, Mordechai, Esther. You have to assume everybody was there, because it doesn't tell us that anybody wasn't there. And so what the students are saying is that way before Haman, again, this is a Yavne reading of Megillat Esther. Way before Yavne, Haman, Achashverosh was a bad guy. He was a ruler, just like the Roman emperors. You don't dance with the devil, you know. Better, and I'll just start with lots of platitudes. Better the devil you know, but don't dance with the devil. This is the devil. This is the person who stopped, according to their reading, he stopped the building of the Beit HaMikdash. Maybe he prevented Jews from moving to Israel. Who knows what it was, but he's not a good guy. Don't go to his feasts, okay?
But are they understanding it like he forced them to go to his feast, or
No.
they chose?
No, in other words, he's saying that they could have made a lot of, Mordechai's a very political person, right? So he may have made an excuse and said, if I don't go, it's going to be bad for the Jewish people, or it's going to be obvious that I'm not there. And it's going to, you know, it's like what people say, you know, I don't want to get into politics, but you know what I would say about US politics, right? Like, oh, I have to, because I have to, whatever. So you can put any name. I have to court President so-and-so, because otherwise what will happen to the Jews so-and-so. Right. So there could be a lot of reasons, but here I want to point out something interesting. That seems to be clear here. Why do the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, why are they focusing on the feast as the reason why Jews were punished? Why are they focusing on the feast as the reason why? And there was an attitude, and we know this is very prevalent in a lot of rabbinic writings, and especially more recent, medieval to modern rabbinic writings, this idea of tshuva, this idea of repentance matching your sin, matching your transgression. So what are they picking up on in the story? What are they picking up on in the story? Esther asks for a 72-hour fast. We don't have any basis for 72-hour fasts. And if you look at the calendar of the story, she doesn't just ask for a 72-hour fast. When is the fasting going on? It's going on the day before the Seder, and the day after the Seder. Because in her mind, according to the rabbis, again, an interpretation, in her mind, she figures to herself, you're not, it's absolutely forbidden to fast on the Seder, right? It's a mitzvah to eat at the Seder. You know, it's a mitzvah. You cannot do intermittent fasting at the Seder. You have to eat at the Seder. By the way, when is the only other mitzvah that we have for eating? Suda of Purim, the feast of Purim. Okay, of course, that's later, but it's exactly parallel to Pesach. It's exactly parallel. Yeah, that's not the same. That's not a Suda in the same way. There are two Sudot. That's the Seder and Purim. So, you know, in terms of festive, you know, in terms of really marking the occasion. So she asks for a 3-day fast. Now we know in Tractate Tani, in the tractate that covers fasts, how long are fasts? 12 hours, 24 hours, you know, the fast that we have, the longest is 24 hours. Most of them are, you know, there is no rabbinic fast that lasts for 72 hours. That's a crazy amount of fasting. And so what are the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, what are they picking up on? They're picking up on this 72-hour fast as being really unusual. And if you're trying to do repentance, if you're trying to do tshuva for something that you did wrong, it must be for all those days of fasting in the first chapter. Feasting. Days and days of feasting that you have in that first page of the first chapter. So they're saying to themselves, that must have been what they did wrong. And that's why they had this threat of destruction hovering over them.
Why is it so obvious to you that when it says, why are the enemies of the Jewish people in that generation deserving of annihilation? Why is it so obvious that that actually means why are the Jews deserving of annihilation?
Because that's how it's read by Rashi, and it's not obvious to me. It's because
they do that over and over.
Yeah, it is. It is a trope. It is definitely a trope where if you're trying to say something, you say the opposite. It's like, you know, those names that people would give to sick children. You know, like where they would try to. It's meant as a
distraction.
A distraction, exactly. It's meant as a distraction in some way, but it wasn't obvious to me.
No,
I had to.
It was like a regular thing that you've been reading in Pirkei Avot or whatever.
Oh yes, it's something that comes up, but not enough in my reading to have known that that's what it meant. But when I went to Sefaria and looked at the English, it made it very obvious. And then when I looked further, it was that was the case. But it's a good question. And then Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai continues, and he says to them, "Inken, if that's the case, that it really was because they went to this feast, Imken shebeshushan yehargu shebechol haolam kulo al yehargu." If that's the case, he makes a very good point to his students. He says, if that's the case, then only the Jews who went to the feast would be punished or liable for punishment. It wouldn't be all these other Jews. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai here is highlighting a very important point that is an important point for the rabbis of Yavne at this moment, right? Achashverosh was the king of Persia, which was basically the entire civilized world. Every Jewish community was under his control, under his power, right? Whether or not you were in Israel, whether or not you were in Alexandria, whether or not you were in Syria and Baghdad, it didn't matter. You were under Persian rule. So this king, if he was bad for the Jews of Shushan, he was bad for everyone, right? He was bad for the entire Jewish community. There's another aspect of this, which they're trying to understand. The Jews in the end didn't get destroyed. They weren't destroyed, right? There was a threat of destruction, and they lived with, right, the Shushan Nevocha, right? They lived with this incredible fear and incredible tension. But at the end, it ended up being a threat that was not carried through. And so that's more what they're talking about. Why would they live under this cloud? Why would God force them? God's not punishing them, so to speak, with actual destruction. The punishment is the threat of destruction. Okay, so that's an interesting concept that these Jews in Yavne, it's an interesting one for them to be parsing, right? Because they've just lived through destruction, but they are still hoping for redemption. They're very different than the Jews who come later. The Babylonian Jews who edit the Talmud, who edit the Gemara, those Jews, they already understand there's no going back, right? They're like our ancestors, like our great-great-grandparents. They're like, yeah, we're not going back. There is no redemption happening in 70 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. We're not going back. So you see a changing, right?
Back to here.
Back to Israel, back to a temple, back to anything, right? This is not happening imminently. We pray for it, but we know it's not happening tomorrow. Whereas Shimon Bar Yochai and his students are living in a very different time. They could go back. They're already in Israel, but they could go back to a temple. They could go back to a redemption. So it's very interesting that they're kind of parsing this idea of what it means to live in this limbo that the Jews in Shushan lived in, right? It was impending destruction. It wasn't yet happening, and in the end, it didn't happen. So they're kind of questioning that. So I want now, yes.
Can you just remind us the story of Purim is happening how many years after Israel,
According
Jews
to
were brought to
so according to rabbinic history, it's happening 70 years, 100 years later. So it's very soon later. Yes. Academically, I can't tell you. Okay, so let's go to, I want to go back to the question now of the divinity of the text, right? Because God is missing, and this is what bothers the rabbis most, okay? And I want to look at the different ways in which the rabbis of Yavne, the rabbis really right after the destruction of the temple will read it differently than the rabbis who are coming 100 years later, again, from Babylonia, who are not in Eretz Yisrael and are not going back to Eretz Yisrael, know that they're not going back to Eretz Yisrael. So let's read that difference. And when I got to this, I was like, this is perfect because it has all the main characters in it. Okay, so this is source 3. Rabbi Meir Omer, Esther Baruch HaKodesh Nemra. Okay, so Rabbi Meir says the book of Esther was written with the inspiration of divine spirit. And remember, that's the major question. There is not a single other book in Tanakh that doesn't mention God. Okay, so how are we going to put this book how are we going to accept this book? So Rabbi Meir he was famous for being the student of Elisha ben Abuya, who was the heretic, the kofar, the person who went OTD, off the derech. What? Ha'acher, exactly, the other one, who had been a student, for people who have been taking the class, Elisha ben Abuya was the student of Eliezer ben Horkanus, and also Rabbi Yoshua. So he was Elisha ben Abuya. We'll talk about him more. He's a really interesting character. He was a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, and Rabbi Meir was his student. The famous story of Elisha ben Abuya is riding on a donkey on Shabbat, and he's having a machloket. He's having a debate with his student Rabbi Meir, and then at a certain point, he says, Rabbi Meir, you have to stop walking because we've reached the edge of where we can walk on Shabbat. He continues on his donkey and Rabbi Meir turns around. It's a really great story that hopefully we'll get to. Rabbi Meir was Rabbi Meir's wife, Bruria, one of the only mentioned female heroes in the Mishnah. Okay, so Rabbi Meir Omer, Esther Baruch HaKodesh Nemra, it's clearly a divinely inspired book. Shenemar vivada hadavar leMordechai. Okay, and I'm not going to get it. I cut out a lot of the explanation. How do we know? Because Esther was divinely inspired, because it says it was known to Mordechai that he knew what was going on. What did it mean? He knew what was going on. He knew what Bigtan and Teresh. He knew what those two guys and the two Persians were. They weren't actually Persian. They were of a different ethnicity. And he understood that they were plotting against Achashverosh. And of course, once Achashverosh realizes that Mordechai saved him, then the entire story pivots, right? The entire story shifts. Rabbi Yossi ben Dormaskit, also living at the same time as Rabbi Meir, also living in this period of Yavna, he says, Esther Baruch HaKodesh Ne'amar Shne'amar Ubabizat Lo Shalchu Et Yadam. When the Jews of Shushan destroy the Persians who were going to kill them, it says they do not touch any of the booty. They don't touch any of the plunder. Remember, just a side note, remember that was the whole issue with Shmuel. It was Shaul. King Shaul, he let his men take booty from Amalek and actually let King Agag live long enough to have a child and long enough for Haman to come into the picture, but that's a different analysis of Megillat Esther. So how do you possibly know that not a single Jew touched the plunder? It must have been divinely inspired. And there are a few more, even there's a Rabbi Akiva one here, I think, as well. But Shmuel, who comes much later than these rabbis, at least 100 years later, in Bavel, he's one of the leading Amoraim. He's one of the leading rabbis of the next generation after these rabbis. He says, I have hatam, have amina milta. He's not immodest. He says, had I been living at the time of Yavna, I would have been able to tell these guys they're all wrong. They're all wrong. How do we know that Esther is divinely inspired? Because it says in the 9th chapter, it says, Kiemu vikiblu, that the Jews in Persia, they accepted, they confirmed, and they kiblu, they took it upon themselves. What did they take upon themselves? That they were going to celebrate Purim, that they were going to give matanot le'evyonim, that they were going to, all those things. They took it upon themselves. So how does Shmuel read this? Kiemu lamala masha kiblu lamata. That in the heavens, it doesn't mean, why do we have two words meaning the same thing? That they accepted and they accepted. It's that the Jews down on earth said, this is what we're doing. And the heavens, meaning God, divinely accepted it. Okay, so rather than God saying, this is what you do, and the Jews down below saying, okay, this is what we're going to do, it went the opposite direction. The Jews said, this is what we're doing, this is what we're confirming. And God says, I'm also accepting this. Now, what is this a reference to? This is a reference to a very well-known understanding, a well-known rabbinic interpretation that well, not lo b'shamayim, it can be related to that as well, which that's a very good point. But there is an understanding that Shmuel is referencing here, which is that Purim has as much importance as is more important, will supersede what happened at Har Sinai, what happened at Mount Sinai. Why is that? Because there's a famous midrash, I didn't put it here, but there's a famous midrash that when God went around to all the different nations and asked them to accept the Torah, they all said no, they had reasons not to. Finally, God said to the Jewish people, God said, okay, accept the Torah. And they said no, and they said no. And then God took Mount Sinai, hovered it, threatened, over their heads. And then what did they say? They said, Na'aseh v'nishma, meaning we will do and we will accept. So they said it backwards. They didn't say nishma v'na'aseh. They didn't say we'll understand it and then we'll do it. They're like, okay, we'll do it and then we'll understand it later. Okay. According to this midrash, when did they reverse it? Nishma v'na'aseh, we'll accept it and then we'll understand it on Purim in Megillat Esther. So Shmuel is referencing that understanding that Purim is actually a tikkun. It's an improvement on going all the way back to Har Sinai, going all the way back to Mount Sinai. And so Shmuel is seeing the book of Esther. He's reading the book of Esther as a diaspora Jew. He's reading the book of Esther as someone who is reading it infused with hope, infused with the idea that even outside of Israel, even when we don't see God, even when God is hidden, we can find hope, we can find redemption, and we can find victory. Whereas Rabbi Meir and his cohort, is still in that limbo stage where they still feel like we just have to get through this. We have to get through a few more years, and then we'll be able to go back to where we were. And Shmuel's already past that. So while they are reading it in a very more mundane way, like, oh, it's definitely divinely inspired, you can see that Shmuel is carrying much more weight. He's reading much more weight and much more hope into Megillat Esther. And in fact, we have a very, very famous statement. This is from Tractate Chulin that supports what Shmuel just says, also coming from a later rabbi from Bavel, from Babylonia. Esther mina Torah minayin. How do we know that Esther is actually from the Torah, that was divinely inspired? Va'anochi hester astir, from this line in Deuteronomy, which I put the whole pasuk in English. This is this very, very disturbing. It's the Vayelech, from Parshat Vayelech, right before Moses dies. Okay, God says, after you die, you're about to die, and after you die, my anger will be kindled against these people, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured, and many evils and troubles shall come upon them, so that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us, because our God is not among us? And I will hide my face on that day for all the evil which they shall have wrought, and that they are turned to other gods. So it's a very frightening verse. It's a very frightening verse, but God says, haster astir, I will be hidden. And this is a message, really, this is a message for the future. This is not a message for the rabbis in Yavne. This is a message for the future, basically saying, when things seem the worst, it will seem like God is not there. Just like in Megillat Esther, it seemed like God was not there. But we will find hope. We will find ways to survive, and we will find miracles and ways that we can continue. And this next one, also from a Babylonian rabbi, number 5, Amar Rabbi Asi, Lama nimshala Esther l'shachar. Why was Esther likened to the dawn? Why was Esther like the dawn? Lomar lach, ma shachar sof kol halayla, just like the dawn is the end of the night. And we're coming up to Pesach, where they talk about what does night mean. Just like the dawn is the end of the night, af Esther sof kol hanisim. Also, Esther is the end of all miracles. And this is a really interesting line, right? Because on the one hand, the end of night is a positive thing. Finally, you get through the night. Finally, you get through the darkness, and here's the dawn. Here's rebirth. But then he also says that Esther's also the end of all miracles, which sounds negative, right? What does that mean? It's the end of all miracles.
That's the period in church history where open miracles are.
Exactly. And we've been talking about that in this class, both for the rabbis of Yavne, but also for the rabbis later. The end of prophecy, the end of knowing what God wants of you, the end of knowing what is our connection to God. And so Esther really, and kind of encapsulates all of that mystery. So also Seter, when you have something that's secret, when you have something hidden, you also have mystery. And Esther embodies that in her name, right? She's both secret, she's both there, but she's also secret, she's mysterious. She doesn't reveal a lot, and she becomes emblematic of Jewish strategy, of this idea that this is how you will survive. You will survive in ways that are mysterious, and the miracles won't be outright, and the divine connection won't be outright, but they will remain. And I want to just end with this. This is Rambam. Okay, so Rambam coming in the 12th century. This is in his work that was written in Hebrew, Mishnah Torah, which is his encapsulation of all, his compendium of all Jewish law. Kol sifrei hanevi'im v'kol haktuvim atidin lebatel limot hamashiach chutz Megillat Esther. All the books of the prophets, so all those books that, according to Rabbi Aaron Koller, all the books that when they were written, it was clear they were going to get into Tanakh. all those books are going to become null and void in Messianic times, except for Megillat Esther. והרי היא קיימת כחמישה חומשי תורה וכהלכות של תורה שבעל פה שאינם בתהילים לעולם. This book, Megillat Esther, will be included, it will have the same level as the Torah itself, the 5 books of Torah, and the oral law. It will be on level with that. Those things will never be canceled forever, for eternity. ואף על פי שכל זיכרון הצרות יבוטל שנאמר כי נשכחו הצרות הראשונות וכי נסתרו מעיניי. Again, the word seter. This is a quote from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah. For the former difficulties will be forgotten, and for they will be hidden from my eye. So even though all those things will be forgotten, Yemei HaPurim lo yibatlu. The days of Purim will not be canceled. Shneimar, like it says in Esther, V'yemei HaPurim ha'ele lo ya'avru mitoch ha'Yehudim v'zichram lo yasuf mizer'am. And these days of Purim will not pass from among the Jews, nor will their remembrance cease from their seed. So even though it's like the end of miracles and it's where is God, and it really doesn't fit, Maimonides, Rambam says, it's the hefech, it's the opposite. It's because of those things, those are central to Jewish identity. Those are central to the way we act in this world. We don't need the prophetic connection. We don't need to see God revealed because God is mysterious and God can remain mysterious. We will fuel our existence. We will fuel our future. We will fuel our hope. And we will know that it's divinely inspired. We don't need to see it in an outright miracle. And so for Rambam, for Maimonides, Esther becomes the pinnacle of that foresight. So different than the way the rabbis of Yavne looked at it, starting from the Babylonian period through Maimonides and much later. Esther becomes this, because of the contradictions in Esther, that becomes the source of inspiration from the book. So we will stop here, and I just want to welcome you again to the class and wish everybody a very happy Purim.